Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Kids Talk Church History. Kids Talk Church History is a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer on Kids Talk Church History, a podcast in partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals.
It's almost Thanksgiving, and we usually hear two different types of stories about the early European settlers in America. Some are about a group of pious and peaceful pilgrims who came to find religious freedom. The other about greedy Europeans who used Christianity to take advantage of Native Americans. Stay with us as we discover the true story of early encounters between Europeans and Native Americans here at Kids Talk Church History. Hi, my name is Trinity. I am 17 and I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
I am Grace. I am 13 years old and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
I am Sean. I am 14 and I live in Augusta, Kansas.
It's true that some early European settlers came with a vision of establishing a godly and peaceful society. It's also true that things didn't go so well later on. It's a long and messy story, and we'll let our guests explain it in more detail. Through all that, there were some peaceful Christians who spent their lives bringing the gospel to Native Americans. One of these first missionaries was John Eliot, who started the so-called praying towns and translated the Bible into one of the Native American languages.
Was he one of the Puritans?
Yes, Eliot was, but he also came about 10 years after the Mayflower, the ship we usually mention when we talk about Thanksgiving.
Did he come as a missionary?
I think he came, like many others, to find a place where he could worship God with other Christians who shared the same beliefs, because the government in England didn't have a good opinion of the Puritans and tried really hard to stop them from preaching. But after he arrived in America, he had a desire to tell the Native Americans about Jesus. He learned their language and started to preach to them in 1646, 15 years after his arrival.
Did the natives appreciate his message?
Not always, but he continued until they started to understand and even asked him to tell them more about Jesus. With their help, he translated the Bible into their language, and that was the first Bible printed on North American soil. He also taught them how to read.
Was he one of the only missionaries?
He worked with others. He had some Native Americans helping him, and there was also a young English minister, Daniel Gookin. Gookin was one of the loudest voices about the mistreatment of Native Americans. He said they were among Jesus's most faithful followers. He even called them martyrs for the Christian religion because they had suffered so much.
Yes, many people back then thought that the Native Americans were inferior to whites.
And unfortunately, some didn't even consider them human beings. They had the same idea about Africans or people of other races. And this attitude caused so many wars, or at least made them worse. Even the Christians at Eliot's praying towns were almost entirely killed in these wars.
I've read that Eliot thought the wars were used by the devil to destroy God's work.
And it's true that some people left the faith after seeing the terrible example given by some Europeans who called themselves Christians. But the amazing thing is that many of Native Americans still kept the faith.
And when a Native American chief complained to Gookin that his people had been terribly mistreated, Gookin said, "You know that not all Indians are good. It's the same with the English, and this is why we must expect while we are in this world."
There are both sad and encouraging stories in the history of the early American colonies, and we better let our guest, Dr. Matthew Tuininga, tell us more. Dr. Tuininga is professor of Christian ethics and the history of Christianity at Calvin Theological Seminary in Michigan and author of the book The War of the Worlds of the Lord, the Puritan Conquest of America's First People. Dr. Tuininga, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you spending your time with us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You've heard us talking a little bit about John Eliot and the early Christian missions to the Native Americans. Did we get anything wrong, or is there anything that might provide some more context?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that jumped out at me that you said when you made the comment that I forget if you said most of the people in the praying towns died during the wars. I don't think it was quite that bad. I mean, many died, but there are a lot of, if you just Google this on the internet, there are a lot of false statistics and stories that are told. And sometimes when you dig into the primary sources, you see that somehow the stories have been exaggerated over time. So I wouldn't want people to have the impression that most of them died. Certainly many did.
Thank you for that clarification. We appreciate it. Um, we know very little about the early Christian missions to the Native Americans. Do you mind telling us a little bit more about it, maybe?
Yeah, so you've given a great introduction to John Eliot. I mean, he's an interesting guy because he was a full-time minister of a congregation, the church in Roxbury, and he just took it on himself to do much more than that. The colony had said that the conversion of the natives was its primary purpose, but for most people that didn't actually take up much of their time and energy. But for him, that was his primary calling, and so he devoted so much of his life to first teaching the natives, then training other natives so that they could teach their own people. He really thought that was going to be the key step so that they could have their own teachers and preachers. Then he tried to organize them into praying towns where they could actually live a Christian lifestyle. And we can get into that a little bit more later, some of the assumptions he had about that. But in the course of his life, he helped establish 14 of these praying towns with thousands of people in them. He helped establish 2 full churches that were self-governed by native Christians. And if it hadn't been for King Philip's War, that process probably would have continued. He also sort of invented the Algonquin language as a written language because native languages were only oral. They didn't have a written alphabet, but he invented an alphabet and started publishing the Bible and other books in their language and actually helped preserve that language to this day. So there's so much we could talk about there, but it's quite the story. And of all the English colonies, only New England had such a successful, thriving missionary community.
You mentioned the wars and the problems in the book, or the problems that took place between the European settlers and the Native Americans, and you described them in detail in your book. Could you explain them simply for our listeners and why you think that the Europeans who came to America, claiming to be devout Christians, ended up fighting the Native Americans?
Yeah, I think the majority of them, at least their leaders, came over with the best of intentions. But you have to remind yourself that we're talking about 2 civilizations that had had virtually no contact with each other for thousands of years. And so they have completely different languages, completely different culture, completely different religion, very different ways of doing government, of just providing for your needs, how you organize towns, how you organize families, even something as simple as what it meant to sell land. There's so much confusion between the 2 groups as to what it meant when they're signing their names to the same legal document. And so the room for misunderstanding is just enormous. And then you add on top of that, that as Christians, they believed that all pagan religions were false and that pagans are deceived by the devil. And so that led them to have a pretty negative assessment. Anytime Indian culture differed from English culture, it was very tempting for the Puritans to think that, well, the English were the way they were because of Christianity, and the natives were the way they were because of paganism, and therefore the English way was superior, which is not always the case and is not always a fair assessment. And so I think if you pile in all those different aspects, and then also on top of that, different understandings of what justice looks like. So whenever you have different groups of people living together, right, they have conflict, and that conflict has to be resolved by judges and legal processes. And when you have 2 very different understandings of what that's supposed to look like, that creates a lot of tension too. And then on top of all of that, the English were so superior when it came to technology and military and even increasingly population that it was very easy for them to just force their way onto the natives. And I think that all of that is just highly combustible. It's very easy for all of that to lead to a conflict and therefore lead to a war. But I will say that despite that, in about the 56 years covered by my book, only 3 or 4 of those years were actually years of warfare. So we need to remember that the vast majority of that time while there was conflict, was still largely peaceful.
It's hard for Christians today to admit that some Christians in the past had some very misguided ideas, but we shouldn't try to ignore it or change facts. Was it difficult for you to write your book?
Every book I've written is very difficult, though for different reasons. Um, I think what made this one difficult, when I originally started writing it, I thought that I was going to evaluate the Puritans and what they did, and I was going to criticize where their thinking went wrong, where it was good, and what exact mistakes they made. But the more I studied how complicated the actual story was, I realized how hard it was to evaluate them, because it was very easy for me to criticize them or judge them from my 21st century standpoint. But in many cases, they were trying to do what they thought was right, and given what they knew, um, it's hard to know how they could have done differently. To give an example, we can say all we want about the problems of colonization, but if you're a colonist and your town is being attacked by Indians who are slaughtering everybody or taking them off into slavery, you're going to fight back and you're going to pray to God to deliver you from this evil. So um, that's how most people were not the people making all the big decisions. Most people are just trying to live their lives and navigate the circumstances in which they find themselves. So what I ended up doing is deciding not to constantly evaluate what they were doing. And instead, I thought my responsibility is to tell their story as fairly and accurately as I can. And to give each of the characters in it, who are real people, of course, an honest voice of how they experienced it, and then leave it up to my readers to evaluate, and ultimately leave it up to God to judge.
So, what made you decide to write this book?
Well, I think Trinity, in your first sentence, you kind of touched on this. The way that we are usually told about the Pilgrims or the Puritans is kind of a feel-good story about people pursuing religious freedom. And if you're a Christian, as I am, then you take a lot of inspiration from how zealous they were for their faith and how much they were willing to suffer for it. And, then though, as I got older, I started to hear the more horrible stories about the wars um, and just how brutal they could be. And it struck me, how could these be the same people? How are the same people from these wonderful stories, these heroes, how could they be the exact same people as the villains of these other stories? And it struck me that the two stories needed to be put back together. And so I wanted to show how genuine Christians experienced the whole range of things that we're talking about, how they experienced the things that we admire them for, and how they experience the things that really trouble us, and try to show how that's one really complicated story.
What can Christians today learn from the experiences of Christians in the time period you describe in your book?
Yeah, it's so hard, the learning lessons from history. And I always start the first one, and this is the one that I emphasize to my students too. And I think it's because it's what I learned primarily in writing this, and that's just humility. Um, it's very easy when you know little about somebody or little about their story to criticize them or evaluate them. But the more you get to know them, that's always harder to do, because you see things from their perspective, and you sympathize with them in a way that you wouldn't have before. So I wanted to I want people to learn how to sympathize with other Christians and other people, and and that to give us a sense of humility when we think about how others might judge us for our actions if they don't know us so well. Um, but on top of that, I think I very much think we can learn from the Puritans their zeal for missions and their willingness to suffer for the gospel. Like, despite all the things they did wrong, um, they had a very strong sense of the kingdom of God and the importance of devoting their lives to it that I think relatively few Christians today have. So we can learn a lot from their zeal, even if they didn't do everything right. From native Christians, we can learn what they were willing to give up. They gave up all their kinship ties in many cases with their families. They gave up um, their culture. They gave up so much, and yet they remained faithful to Christ despite how English Christians treated them. So we can learn a lot from that too. And then I think finally, gratitude that I live in the 21st century, that I live in a peaceful country where we actually have a lot of different types of people who can come together and live together and be part of the same church in relative peace. I think that's an incredible achievement. And when you compare it to past ages of history, you realize how much we have, and not to take that for granted, how much God has done to strengthen the church and bring different types of people together in it today.
I've not read your book, but I have read a review that quotes you as saying many I apologize if I pronounce this incorrectly, Narragansetts, Mohegans, and Pequots had long resisted Christianity, accepted it in the 1700s during what might be called the Long Indian Great Awakening. We have just previously recorded an episode talking about the so-called Great Awakening, the one led by people like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. What is the Long Indian Great Awakening?
Yeah, so I had to learn how to pronounce these names too as I was doing this research, but Narragansetts, Mohegans, and Pequots is how I would pronounce those, and they would pronounce them at this point. So yeah, the Long Indian Great Awakening is really part of the same phenomena as the Great Awakening. But whereas, different people define the Great Awakening differently, but it tends to focus on the 1740s, a kind of limited set of preachers and a limited time. The Long Great Awakening is just a term to recognize that the same type of thing was happening among Indians throughout New England throughout the course of decades surrounding the Great Awakening. And in that time period, many of these groups, as I said, that all throughout my book reject Christianity, end up becoming Christian later on. And so what's interesting about it is sometimes historians have pointed out that the Great Awakening's effects sometimes seemed fleeting, where many of the people who were caught up in it later were not, didn't remain part of church or something like that. But for the Indians, it was actually pretty permanent in many ways. Many of these people did remain Christians, and their communities remained Christian for a long time, and even till today.
You also wrote that while many Indians rejected Christianity and still do, for others, Christianity became the key ingredient that held their communities together and enabled them to preserve their culture. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I think some of the best examples are in the book itself. So sometimes the reason why Indians were at first attracted to Christianity is because disease was devastating their community. They were losing their land. And the praying towns was a way for them to come together, get help from the English, both in terms of like military help to protect them from their rival tribes, various tools and supplies to build their towns and to farm and so forth. And that enabled them to build communities with English support, with English protection, that became vibrant communities. And they weren't giving up all their native ways of life. They were giving up some aspects of their native way of life, especially their religion. But in many other ways, these praying towns continued to live Indian way of life. And so it's not that they're trading their civilization for a Christian one. They're embracing Christianity, but they're using it in many ways to continue building their kinship networks, their families, their communities. And that continued, even during the war, when many of these praying towns were destroyed, the people of them maintained their communities. Even if they moved to another place as refugees, they would still maintain that sort of connection. And as a result, they still endured after the war. And in place after place today, if you go, like, for example, the Narragansetts, if you go to Narragansett country today, there's a reservation there. And at the heart of that reservation is a stone church that was built in the 1700s. And that's because that was the center of their community for all that time. And it's a testimony to it. Another place that I've spent less time myself, but in Martha's Vineyard today there are still thousands of people with Native heritages who are part of churches there, and where the churches continue to play a significant role for them even until today.
In your book, you use the expression Native Americans, but also Indians and America's first people. Is one of these better than the other?
Yeah, a lot of people ask this question, and people from different countries view it differently. The reality is, natives invariably prefer their tribal names. So if you know their tribal name, use that, like Narragansett or Pequot or Massachusetts or whatnot. That's who they are, right? It's sort of like we wouldn't want to just be described as, based on our sort of race or some group we're lumped in with. We would want to be described based on the community that we're actually part of, right? That's who we are. So that being said, Indians was the common term that was used as well as natives at the time. There's nothing offensive about the term Indian. The vast majority of Indians never took offense at that and don't take offense at that. It's a fine term to use. Natives was a logical term to use at the time because most of the English were not native, right? Whereas the Indians had been living there for generations. I find the term Native American is fine, it's accepted, but to me, it's actually almost more problematic now because it implies that that other people whose families have been living here for generations are not somehow native to America. So I use the terms Indians and natives interchangeably if I don't know the tribal group, and if I know the tribal group, I try to use that, and I think that's the best way to approach it.
If you could meet anyone from the period you describe in your book, who would that be?
Yeah, that's a hard question because there's so many. I would love to meet them all, even the ones that maybe wouldn't seem so pleasant. But if I had to choose, and there's one guy named Captain Tom, and that's what the English called him. Tom Wetasapunkanam was his native full name. He had been one of Eliot's first converts and had professed his faith early on, and then became he was also a native leader among the Nipmuc peoples, and he had brought many of the Nipmuc peoples into Christianity to come and make an alliance with the English and have praying towns established among them. He was then appointed as a leader of the praying Indians of many of these towns. But very sadly, during the war, his people were taken captive by hostile Nipmucs, and he was accused of having betrayed the English to the enemy. And it's a very sad story. In the end, he was brought to Boston Common and he was executed. And as he was executed, he continued to plead his innocence, and he raised his hands up in the air and was praying to God as he gave out his dying breath. So he's a very Christ-like figure to me, and I would, we don't have anything that he wrote. We only have what people said about him, and I would love to know how he actually thought about and experienced all of that. But the other one is one that one of you mentioned earlier, Daniel Gookin, because he was such a passionate advocate for the natives, and he's the one who more than anyone told the story of their sufferings and compared them to Christ. But I'd have lots of questions for him. I would want to ask him now, looking back, after his life was over, what he thought about colonization and what they could have done differently and should have done differently. So, yeah, I would love to meet them all, and maybe someday I will get to meet many of them.
Have you ever thought of writing a simple version of your book for children or young adults?
I have. So this may come as a surprise to you, but when I was writing the book, before it reached its final version, I read the entire thing to my kids, who at the time were, I guess, probably ages 8, 10, and 12-ish, because it's been a few years. And if they ever couldn't follow something or understand something or found it completely boring, I would change it and try to make it more interesting because I wanted them to be able to read it. And I would think, well, it's a big book and it's a dense book, and a lot of kids might find that difficult. They actually would find it fairly easy to understand if they read it. And that's partly because that's why I did it. I love teaching young kids. And yes, I've thought about doing that. And if I knew there was a lot of interest in it, I would be very open to doing it.
Dr. Tuininga, we are so thankful that you agreed to spend this time with us and to answer our questions. And listeners, be sure to check out our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org, and let us know what you think of these episodes and keep asking questions. As soon as we're able, we'll pass them on to our guest experts. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts, Grace and Sean, I'm Trinity. Thank you so much for listening, Kids Talk Church History.